There's a particular kind of mind that works best when the world is quiet. Not because it's running from something, but because it's running towards something. Clarity, understanding, truth. If you've ever watched an INTJ carefully, you might notice they're not actually afraid of people. They're evaluating them, constantly analyzing, assessing, calculating the logic behind every interaction, watching for inconsistencies, looking for the hidden pattern beneath the surface-level conversation. And that takes energy, tremendous energy. It's like having a background program running constantly, processing information at a level most people never access. Which is why home isn't a place of defeat for an INTJ. It's a headquarters. It's the command center where they can finally stop processing other people's inefficiency and start designing their own world. Where the constant analysis can finally rest. Where they don't have to translate themselves into something more palatable or digestible for others to understand. INTJ stands for introverted, intuitive thinking and judging. And if you understand what those words actually mean beyond the pop psychology labels, you understand why so many INTJ gravitate towards staying home. The introverted part doesn't mean they're shy. It means their brain processes information internally before externalizing it. Small talk isn't just boring to an INTJ. It's neurologically exhausting. They're mapping out the conversation, detecting inconsistencies, recognizing social scripts, predicting where it's going. It's like being a chess player in a game of checkers. Exhausting doesn't begin to cover it. And that's before we even talk about the judging part. Which, despite what it sounds like, doesn't mean judgmental. It means they prefer structure, closure, clear frameworks. The outside world is chaos. Variables, unpredictability, people who don't follow through on what they said they would do. Home, though, home is controllable. Home is a system where everything has a place and a purpose, where the logic is pure and the outcomes are predictable. For an INTJ, staying home isn't avoidance. It's optimization. You have to understand something about how an INTJ brain works. They see patterns where others see randomness. They spot inefficiencies that make them physically uncomfortable. Watch an INTJ in a group setting for 5 minutes, and you'll see them mentally redesigning the entire conversation. Why are we discussing this tangent? What's the actual objective? Why is everyone being so indirect? The structure's all wrong. The logic doesn't follow. The desire to point out these things, to optimize everything and everyone around them, is almost irresistible. It's like watching someone solve a math problem incorrectly and biting your tongue not to correct it. But they know from experience that most people don't want to be optimized. They don't want the sharp truth of an INTJ's assessment. They want to be validated. They want to feel comfortable. They want someone to listen without judgment. And that's not how an INTJ's brain naturally functions. Their brain is wired for truth, not comfort. For accuracy, not feelings. So what do? They go home. They close the door. And in that space, they don't have to mask. They don't have to soften their directness or pretend that inefficiency doesn't bother them. They don't have to smile when something illogical is presented as fact. They can think in straight lines without constantly adjusting for other people's emotional responses, without calculating how to phrase something so it won't offend, without doing the emotional labor that social interaction demands. The home becomes a sanctuary not from people, but from the exhaustion of translating themselves into a language that feels more palatable to others. It's refuge and prison at the same time. INTJ have what psychologists call a high internal locus of evaluation. Basically, that means they trust their own judgment more than external feedback. They don't need constant reassurance that they're doing things right. because they've already done the mental math and determined the optimal approach. This is confidence, but it's also isolation, because while they're solving complex problems in their minds, calibrating systems, building frameworks, other people are out there building relationships through shared experiences. And by the time an INTJ realizes they haven't seen a friend in 3 months, the friendship has often shifted. Not because they don't care, but because the energy equation didn't add up. Going out requires preparation. Small talk requires translation. Social niceties require scripts. And most of the time, INTJ look at that list and think, why not just stay in and work on something that actually matters to me? At home, an INTJ can pursue what they find genuinely interesting without the constant negotiation that comes with existing in shared spaces. They can think about the big picture. They can explore ideas without someone derailing the conversation into gossip or small talk. They can be alone with their thoughts, which for an INTJ is actually the most rewarding place to be. There's a distinction between being alone and being with oneself. An INTJ at home is with themselves. They're not lonely in the way most people understand it. They're not yearning for connection. They're engaged. They're processing. They're building mental models of how the world works. They're reading voraciously, not to escape reality, but to understand it more deeply. They're writing, creating, designing systems that might never be seen by another human being, and they don't need them to be. The product is secondary to the process of thinking deeply. And deep thinking, real deep thinking, requires stillness. It requires absence of external interruption. The INTJ who stays home isn't wasting time. They're doing the internal work that reshapes how they see everything. Most people don't understand that. They see silence and assume it's emptiness. They see someone decline an invitation and assume they're depressed or antisocial. But inside that quiet, there's a constant motion of thought, analysis, projection, strategic planning. An INTJ's mind rarely stops working. The only difference between an INTJ at home and an INTJ forced into social situations is that at home, they can let their mind run in its native language. No translation required. Here's what psychology reveals about highly independent thinkers. They're often the ones who achieve breakthrough insights because they've spent enough time alone with their thoughts to see connections others miss. The INTJ who stays home is essentially doing research on themselves and the world. They're testing hypotheses. They're observing human behavior patterns from a distance and drawing their own conclusions rather than absorbing received wisdom. This kind of thinking is what produces innovation. Not collaboration in the traditional sense, but individual reflection that eventually gets shared. Vincent van Gogh painted alone. Tesla designed alone. Marie Curie worked in isolation. None of them were antisocial by pathology. They were strategically withdrawn because that's where their best work happened. An INTJ who loves staying home is in good historical company. But let's talk about the shadow side. Because there is one. Sometimes what looks like preference is actually avoidance. An INTJ might retreat home, not just because they enjoy it, but because social interaction has hurt them. They've been misunderstood so many times, had their directness interpreted as coldness, had their independence misread as rejecting others. At some point, staying home stops being about optimization and starts being about self-protection, and that's where the psychology gets complicated. Because an INTJ who stays home due to genuine preference is fundamentally different from an INTJ who stays home because they've been wounded by how they're perceived. One is thriving in solitude. The other is suffering in it, just quietly. The distinction matters because the INTJ who's avoiding rather than choosing is usually aware of it. They feel the tension. They know they're cutting themselves off. And there's guilt. Because INTJ are strategic enough to recognize that complete isolation isn't sustainable, that relationships matter even if they don't come naturally, that the world has more to teach them than their own mind can generate. So they feel stuck between their genuine need for solitude and their understanding that humans need connection. This is where the INTJ psychology gets particularly interesting. They're the personality type most likely to overestimate how much they need to be alone and underestimate how much they need other people. They tell themselves they don't need relationships, when what they actually mean is they don't need surface-level relationships. They don't need constant communication or group activities or the typical markers of connection that most people use. What they actually crave, though they might not admit it, is depth, real understanding. Someone who doesn't need explanation, who can follow their logic without pushback, who values clarity as much as they do. These connections are rare, rarer than friendships based on proximity or shared interests. So the INTJ stays home, partly by choice, partly because finding the right people is statistically improbable and emotionally risky. Why put in the effort for a mediocre connection when solitude feels more rewarding? It's logical, it's efficient, but it's also lonely in a way that doesn't show on the surface. What psychologists notice is that INTJ often have a hidden vulnerability. They present as confident, assured, operating from a place of unwavering logic, unshakable, self-contained, independent to the point of appearing invulnerable. But beneath the layers of rational analysis and systematic thinking, there's often a fear that if people really knew them, really saw the way their minds work, they'd be rejected. Not for doing anything wrong, but for simply being fundamentally different, for seeing connections others miss, for questioning things people take for granted, for refusing to pretend that mediocrity is acceptable. So they choose the safety of home, where their strangeness becomes simply their normal, where their directness isn't offensive, it's just fact. They choose the company of their own thoughts, where they don't risk being fundamentally misunderstood, where the logic that feels natural to them doesn't have to be translated into something softer. It's protective. It's also limiting. An INTJ at home is building mastery over their own world while potentially narrowing their perspective. Because perspective doesn't come just from internal reflection. It comes from collision with other minds, from the friction of encountering someone whose logic follows different rules, from being challenged in ways that can't be resolved by thinking harder alone. And that collision often has to happen outside the safety of solitude. The INTJ who loves staying home needs to understand something about themselves. The silence they crave isn't just about avoiding noise or inefficiency. It's about control. And control, while necessary for functioning, can become a prison if it's absolute. The structured, predictable home environment feels safe because the INTJ knows exactly what to expect. They understand the systems. They've already worked through the variables. But growth, real growth, requires stepping into situations where they don't already have all the answers, where the logic isn't immediately apparent, where other people's irrationality actually teaches them something about humanity they couldn't learn alone. But here's the thing about INTJ psychology that often gets overlooked. They're deeply idealistic. They hold themselves and the world to incredibly high standards. The reason they struggle with social interaction isn't because they're emotionally cold. It's because they're profoundly disappointed by mediocrity. They see how things could be better, how people could be kinder, how systems could function more efficiently. And the gap between the ideal and the actual is almost physically painful for them. So home becomes a refuge where they can design things as they should be, where the standards they set are actually met, where excellence isn't theoretical but practical. This is why many INTJ who stay home are actually quietly productive. They're writing, building, creating, often with the intention of eventually sharing their work, but always first for the sake of getting it right. The psychology of the INTJ at home includes this tension. They want to be understood, but they don't make understanding easy. They want connection, but they don't participate in the normal mechanisms of connection building. They want to change the world, but they often do it from their bedroom, designing systems no one will ever know they designed, solving problems that seem invisible to everyone else. In one sense, this is efficient. No wasted energy on small talk or superficial networking. No compromise of their ideas through external influence. But in another sense, it's a kind of waste. The INTJ has so much to offer and so little patience for the slow, messy process of actually offering it. What's interesting psychologically is that INTJ often discover that staying home is actually not about what they're avoiding, but about what they're practicing. They're practicing autonomy. They're training themselves to think independently, to make decisions without consensus, to trust their own judgment completely. In that sense, home is a gymnasium for the mind. It's where they build the mental strength to eventually be okay with standing alone in their beliefs, even in rooms full of people. The INTJ who loves staying home is often an INTJ who's developing the confidence to not care what others think, which is paradoxical because they're doing it in private. But that's how it works sometimes. You have to practice alone before you can execute in public. There's also a temporal element to INTJ psychology that matters here. INTJs tend to think in long time horizons. They're not focused on immediate gratification or present moment enjoyment. They're always asking, what am I building toward? What's the end state I'm trying to create? And from that perspective, staying home early in life, using that time to develop skills, knowledge, and systems, makes perfect strategic sense. They're playing a different game than people who are out there accumulating experiences and social currency. The INTJ is accumulating knowledge and capability, and that trade-off in their mind is sound. Maybe it is, or maybe by the time they're ready to use all that knowledge and capability, they've also become rusty at the social skills that would help them actually deploy it in the world. The truth about INTJ and staying home is that it's not a disorder or a problem to be solved. It's a strategy. A personality-driven strategy that has both advantages and costs. The advantages are undeniably clear. Deep focus, real achievement, internal alignment. They're not fragmented between who they are and who they're performing to be. That fragmentation that so many people experience, splitting themselves into different versions for different audiences, that doesn't happen when you're home alone. You're only ever yourself. The costs, though, are subtler but equally real. Missed connections, narrow perspectives, the slow erosion of social skills that, like any skill, atrophy without practice. The cognitive flexibility that comes from adapting to unexpected social situations. And the hidden cost, the one INTJ often don't articulate but feel acutely, is the kind of loneliness that comes from being fundamentally unknown. From having no one in the world who truly comprehends how your mind works. Psychology tells us that humans need to be seen and understood, not in the way that requires constant social interaction, but in the way that requires at least one or two people truly knowing who you are. The INTJ who stays home is betting that they can be known only by themselves. And maybe they can. Maybe that's enough. But maybe it isn't. Maybe the INTJ psychology includes the capacity to be known by others, to share the landscape of their mind with someone who can follow the logic. But that capacity atrophies in the absence of practice. The INTJ who never steps out never discovers what connection at their level actually feels like, never finds someone who speaks their language natively. And that's a quiet tragedy hidden inside the sanctuary of home. What if the INTJ who loves staying home is actually incomplete? Not fundamentally broken, not antisocial or pathological, but simply unfinished. Waiting for the right conditions, the right person, the right moment to step out of the carefully constructed world and test whether it can all function outside these walls. That's the unspoken fear underneath a lot of INTJ choices. That if they leave, if they fail socially, they'll have to confront that the whole system they built at home was just compensation. That their solitude wasn't preference but avoidance. That their superiority was actually insecurity. But here's what's interesting about INTJ psychology when you study it deeply. That fear, that vulnerability, that's actually where humanity lives. The INTJ who can acknowledge that might be more complete than the INTJ who insists on total self-sufficiency. Because self-awareness includes understanding your own limitations. And an INTJ's primary limitation isn't intelligence or capability. It's the blindness that comes from never being challenged. It's the echo chamber of their own perfect logic. And that echo chamber, for all its peace, is still just an echo. So what does this mean for the INTJ who loves staying home? It doesn't mean they should force themselves into social situations they hate. It doesn't mean the solitude is wrong. But it does mean the isolation might be incomplete. It means the preference might actually be a defense mechanism that's just become so familiar, it feels like authenticity. And authenticity, real authenticity, requires knowing what it feels like to be seen, misunderstood, challenged, and still accepted. Most INTJ haven't had that experience, so they stay home. They build their empire of thought. They practice autonomy. They accumulate knowledge. And maybe eventually they wonder if they missed something. Not because staying home was wrong, but because staying home was incomplete. There's more depth to gain, more understanding to develop, not from books or from their own minds, but from the collision of their mind with someone else's. That's the psychology that often remains unexplored in the INTJ who loves staying at home. Not the question of why they prefer solitude, but whether their preference is free choice or protective mechanism. And sometimes, that's the same question asked two different ways. The answer determines everything.